Well, we're now joined by Peter Montalto, who is a senior emerging markets economist and strategist at Nomura. He joins us from London. Good evening to you, Peter. Let's start with that last point. On a day when the rand is pummeled again, the ANC document talks about managing the rand. It's just one word. Do you sense any shift, perhaps in policy, or is that overblown? And by all accounts, anyway, any efforts to manage the rand would be futile.
Good evening. Well, this has been a long-running debate in the ANC. There are still very strong, loud factions on the left, particularly from places like DTI and Economic Development, who like to talk about managing the rand. But really, the SAB has done a big study. They've looked at every possible option that they have to manage volatility in the currency and found that none of them really work successfully at adequate costs. And I think there's still very strong pushback on doing anything real on this front by National Treasury, by the SAB. But it won't stop the people on the left from making these statements. It's interesting, though, the last time we had this big currency debate before it was brought up, particularly by Ibrahim Patel, was about 4 years ago. The currency was a lot stronger. It was overvalued at that point. We're now closer probably to roughly where fair value is for the currency. So there should really be less need for any of this sort of discussion or policy intervention.
We can talk about what level is best, but in the face of this volatility, the party must be perhaps jealous of China, the likes of China that has these huge reserves to control its currency. There is, of course, this currency fund that all the BRICS nations are joining. Will that make any difference at all?
Not to South Africa. I mean, ultimately, the BRICS fund is for balance of payments crises. It's for when you have a sudden stop of funding of foreigners buying equities and bonds, or they're pulling those investments out. That kind of fund is there at that point. It's not for day-to-day currency policy management. And of course, what's happening with the yuan at the moment is that reserves are being used to some degree to smooth the path towards a weaker currency for the yuan, which is having big spillover impacts into emerging market currencies, and particularly into commodity exporters like South Africa.
Well, the rand is hit when China was doing badly, now the UK, the US doing well. Just explain these global forces buffeting us at the moment.
Well, the real problem for South Africa is that it's very neatly, but unfortunately, at the intersection of all these forces. A study that we've done shows that, for instance, around this terms of trade shock, the lower metals prices globally, South Africa is most hit, certainly in this time zone. That's, of course, a function of slower China growth, which is really impacting those metals prices. At the same time, you have, because the economy is weak in China, devaluation of the currency going on there. That, in turn, impacts the rand. And when you add those two factors together alone, we're targeting already in our models around 13.30 or so for the dollar, for a dollar rand, which is obviously quite a bit higher than still where we are now. That would send pound rand to about 21.50 or so. But then on top of that, you have to add these impacts of the Fed tightening, which is going to come either in September or in December, and is well priced into the market to a degree, but can certainly add a lot of extra volatility. So we may well overshoot that sort of 13.30 target that we have if the Fed is hiking into this mix as well.
So 13.30 is not far off. I believe the all-time low, 13.85 against the dollar. So we're about a rand off that. So you're saying we could hit an all-time low pretty soon?
Well, I think you have to remember you have to look at currencies in real terms as well. And even on that front, the rand is very much weaker than it was in the last couple of years. But it still is not actually undervalued here. And this is the big debate that's going on in the currency market, is with such a large sell-off in the currency in the last couple of years, is it undervalued? Our answer is no. South Africa doesn't gain that much competitiveness because of structural issues, because of unionization, because of fast pass-through of weaker currency into wages. That actually you can have this massive sell-off without necessarily entering undervalued territory quite yet. So yes, there is still further probably to go on this front.
What about the argument that, in fact, we rely on imports? A stronger rand would be better because, like you say, a weaker rand often doesn't help the exporters anyway. Where do we want to be in an ideal world?
Well, I think the SARB has the right kind of line on this, which is that you can't really start fiddling around these issues. The ultimate way, for instance, to balance the current account, to rebalance away from imports towards exports, is structural reform, labour markets, regulation, policy certainty, leadership. All these sorts of factors are ultimately the way to do it, not trying to massage the currency one way or the other ultimately.
Final question for you, Peter, just a general take on the ANC discussion document ahead of tomorrow's meeting. We have seen this move away from free market, unfettered policies to talk of a developmental state, the state that pushes growth. Are we saying the right things in your opinion?
Well, I certainly don't think there's been any change from the Mangaoon resolutions. I mean, the general tone of this is interventionist. It's quite sort of, I don't know, pie in the sky, really, in some degrees. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the comments on the mining sector, it talks about the mining sector creating more jobs and, being able to accelerate jobs growth, particularly of young people. I mean, we're in the complete reverse situation of that, where we're seeing the structural decline of the mining sector and mass job losses that are being contemplated. And in that sense, the document is completely tangential to reality, really, on those sorts of points. I mean, there is no recognition when you read it of a jobs crisis, of a crisis in the mining sector, of deep political changes that need to occur. As you said, there is a realization in the document that growth is unsatisfactory, but really it's taken a huge amount of effort from Nhlanhla Nene to actually convince the ANC of this point, and still it's not really feeding through into these kind of documents in terms of the policy to come out. We'll see what comes up in this discussion from the NGC. As we've seen in Lekota's recently of the ANC, there has been some controversial discussion of radical solutions, but still the status quo seems to continue, whether it's on Eskom and energy policy, jobs or any other related factors.
I'm going to throw in one more, because there is hidden in there also talk of a reduction of port and tariff subsidies for commodity exporters. So we want a strong mining sector, but surely that'll be a blow to our miners. I don't know if you saw that, Peter.
Exactly. I picked up on that line, that paragraph, particularly around Eskom was mentioned later in the paragraph. And it's a classic example of where you're trying to manage administered prices away from cost realities, where you need strong parastatals that can deliver sustainability. Investment in ports is needed, as well as Eskom. You need energy security coming through from the correct tariff structure being in place. And that's ultimately, I think we have to remember how we got in this energy crisis this time around. There were such huge cuts that came through, politically forced cuts in energy tariffs, trying to do this sort of thing, which ultimately has led to the problems of Eskom's balance sheet at the moment. So for me, that was, again, very much more of the same, but a kind of surprise that it was still mentioned there.
All right, thank you very much for your analysis. Peter Montalto from Nomura in London, and talking about our mining sector.